In the early days of September 1900, the bustling coastal city of Galveston, Texas, was completely unaware of the devastation that was about to unfold. Known as the Wall Street of the Southwest, Galveston was one of the wealthiest and most important ports in the United States. The city's prime location on Galveston Island along the Gulf of Mexico had made it a hub of trade and commerce, and its population had grown rapidly, reaching nearly 38,000 by 1900. However, this prosperity came with a dangerous sense of complacency. The city had weathered numerous storms in the past, and the residents believed that they would easily survive any future storms. Even Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, famously wrote in an 1891 article that it would be impossible for a hurricane of significant strength to strike the island. But all of that changed on September 8, 1900, when the Great Galveston Hurricane made landfall. This storm, later known as the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, would go on to claim the lives of an estimated 8,000 people, with some reports suggesting that the number could be as high as 12,000. The city of Galveston was devastated, with nearly every building suffering damage and thousands of homes destroyed. In a matter of hours, the thriving city was reduced to ruins, and the lives of countless families were forever altered. The 1900 Galveston hurricane wasn't just a local disaster, it was a tragedy of epic proportions that had a profound impact on the entire nation. The storm ended Galveston's golden era as potential investors turned to nearby Houston, fearful of future hurricanes. In the wake of the storm, significant changes were made, including the construction of a seawall to protect the city and the raising of the island itself. This introduction sets the stage for a closer look at how this catastrophic event unfolded, starting with the formation of the storm and the initial signs that something was amiss. In the next part, we'll explore how the hurricane developed and the preparations, or lack thereof, that were made as the storm approached the Texas coast. The 1900 Galveston hurricane began its deadly journey as a tropical storm in the far eastern Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa in late August. At the time, meteorology was still a developing science, and the tools available to track and predict storms were rudimentary at best. Despite these limitations, weather observers noticed the formation of a storm system that appeared to be gaining strength as it moved westward across the warm waters of the Atlantic. By the end of the first week of September, the storm had intensified into a full-fledged hurricane, although its exact path remained uncertain. In those days, the United States Weather Bureau, which later became the National Weather Service, relied heavily on reports from ships at sea and limited land-based observations. Communication between different regions was slow, and information about the storm was often outdated by the time it reached the public. As the hurricane approached the Caribbean, it made its first significant landfall in Cuba on September 6th. The storm caused considerable damage but did not lead to widespread alarm in the United States. Unfortunately, the Cuban meteorologists' warnings about the storm's potential severity were largely dismissed by their American counterparts. The Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. predicted that the storm would veer northeastward and spare the Gulf Coast. They did not realize that the hurricane was about to take a more dangerous course. On September 7th, the storm entered the Gulf of Mexico, where it encountered ideal conditions for further intensification. The waters of the Gulf were exceptionally warm, providing the energy needed for the hurricane to strengthen rapidly. By now, it was clear that the storm was heading toward the Texas coast, but the residents of Galveston remained largely unaware of the impending danger. Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, had noticed some concerning signs. The Gulf waters were rising, the wind was picking up, and the barometric pressure was dropping, a clear indication that a powerful storm was approaching. However, like many others, Klein did not believe that a hurricane of great strength could strike Galveston. He assured the public that there was no cause for alarm, even as the signs of an approaching storm became more ominous. By the evening of September 7th, the weather in Galveston had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Heavy rain and strong winds battered the city, but most residents believed it was just another typical Gulf storm. Some even ventured out to the beaches to watch the waves crash against the shore, unaware that within hours those very waves would rise up and engulf their city. As night fell, the storm continued to intensify and the fate of Galveston was sealed. The lack of preparation and the underestimation of the storm's severity would prove to be catastrophic. In the next part, we will delve into the day of the hurricane, when the full force of the storm struck the city, bringing with it unimaginable destruction and loss of life. On the morning of September 8, 1900, the residents of Galveston awoke to a scene that was already foreboding. The winds had grown stronger overnight, whipping through the streets with increasing ferocity. The sky was a heavy, ominous gray, and the usually calm waters of the Gulf had transformed into a raging, turbulent mass. By mid-morning, the situation had become more alarming, as the winds reached hurricane force and the tide began to surge. Despite the growing danger, many in Galveston remained unaware of the severity of the storm that was about to engulf their city. Some, who lived in more vulnerable areas near the coast, had begun to move to higher ground, or to the homes of friends and family. Others, however, believed the storm would pass without significant incident, as so many storms had before. The lack of an official evacuation order or any clear warning only added to the sense of false security. By midday, the full force of the hurricane had arrived. The winds, now exceeding 100 miles per hour, tore through the city, ripping roofs off houses, toppling trees, and turning loose debris into deadly projectiles. The storm's surge, a massive wall of water pushed ashore by the power of the hurricane, began to inundate the island. Water levels rose rapidly, flooding streets, homes, and businesses. The low-lying areas of Galveston were quickly submerged, and the floodwaters continued to rise with alarming speed. The waves, driven by the relentless winds, battered the seawall-less island with incredible force. Entire neighborhoods were swept away as houses, unable to withstand the surge, collapsed and were carried off by the floodwaters. People who had sought refuge in their homes found themselves trapped by the rising water, with few options for escape. Panic set in as the reality of the situation became clear. This was not just a severe storm, it was a catastrophic hurricane unlike anything Galveston had ever experienced. As the day wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The winds continued to strengthen, now reaching their peak at over 130 miles per hour. The storm's surge rose higher, swallowing more of the city and leaving only the tallest buildings and structures above water. Many sought refuge in the few large buildings that remained standing. But even these were not immune to the storm's wrath. The sounds of crashing waves, howling winds, and the destruction of buildings filled the air, creating a terrifying cacophony. The city's communication with the outside world had been cut off, leaving those in Galveston isolated and without any way to call for help. The Weather Bureau had no way of knowing the true extent of the disaster unfolding on the island, and the residents could only rely on their instincts to survive. Some attempted to flee to higher ground, while others clung to whatever they could find, hoping to ride out the storm. By nightfall, the hurricane's fury showed no signs of abating. The floodwaters continued to rise, and the winds, though beginning to taper slightly, were still devastating. The once vibrant city of Galveston was now a scene of utter devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been wiped out, and countless lives were in peril. The destruction was so widespread that it was difficult to comprehend the full scale of the disaster. As the storm finally began to move inland and lose strength, the people of Galveston were left to face the horrifying aftermath. In the next part, we will explore the aftermath of the hurricane, the devastating loss of life, and the heroic efforts of those who survived to help rebuild their shattered city. As the winds finally subsided and the floodwaters began to recede, the true extent of the devastation in Galveston became horrifyingly clear. The city, once a bustling hub of commerce and culture, now lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated, reduced to little more than piles of debris. The elegant mansions that lined the coast, the bustling downtown businesses, and the modest homes of working families were all gone, swallowed by the storm and the sea. Survivors emerged from their makeshift shelters to find a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. Streets were buried under mountains of wreckage, with shattered timbers, broken glass, and twisted metal strewn everywhere. The floodwaters, which had risen as much as 15 feet in some places, had left behind a thick layer of mud and silt, further complicating the already overwhelming task of recovery. The air was thick with the stench of salt water, mud, and decay, and the eerie silence that followed the storm was punctuated only by the sounds of people searching for loved ones and beginning the grim task of collecting the dead. The loss of life was staggering. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely believed that between 6,000 and 12,000 people perished in the hurricane, making it the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Bodies were found everywhere, trapped in the wreckage of their homes, washed up on the shore, or buried under debris. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed the city's ability to deal with them, and many were buried in mass graves or simply lost to the sea. The survivors, many of whom had lost everything, were left to grieve in the midst of unimaginable destruction. The city's infrastructure was in shambles. The water supply was contaminated by salt water and debris, making it unsafe to drink. The telegraph and telephone lines which had once connected Galveston to the outside world were down, leaving the city isolated and without a means to call for help. The railroad bridges that connected the island to the mainland had been destroyed, cutting off any possibility of bringing in supplies or evacuating the wounded and displaced. In the absence of any formal communication, rumors and fear spread quickly among the survivors, adding to the sense of chaos and despair. Despite the overwhelming devastation, the people of Galveston did not give up. In the days following the hurricane, a massive and heroic recovery effort began. Those who had survived the storm immediately set to work, clearing debris, searching for survivors, and caring for the wounded. Makeshift hospitals were established in the few buildings that remained standing, and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide food, water, and shelter to those who had lost everything. Word of the disaster slowly began to reach the mainland, and help soon arrived. Relief efforts were organized, and supplies began to trickle in by boat, the only means of access to the island. The U.S. Army was dispatched to assist with the recovery, and volunteers from across the country came to Galveston to help with the monumental task of rebuilding. The city's residents, though devastated by their losses, showed remarkable resilience and determination as they began to piece their lives back together. The rebuilding process was slow and fraught with challenges. With so much of the city destroyed, there was a shortage of materials and labor, and the work was often dangerous. Many of the buildings that had survived the storm were damaged beyond repair and had to be demolished, further adding to the sense of loss. But despite these difficulties, the people of Galveston pressed on, driven by a desire to rebuild their city and honor the memory of those who had been lost. In the final part, we will explore how Galveston rose from the ashes of this disaster, the lessons learned from the hurricane, and the lasting impact it had on the city and its people. In the aftermath of the hurricane, Galveston faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a city nearly wiped off the map. The task was daunting, but the people of Galveston were determined to restore their home. The process began with clearing the massive amounts of debris that littered the island. This was no small feat, as the storm had left behind mountains of rubble, tangled with remnants of homes, businesses, and lives that had been lost. Volunteers, military personnel, and the remaining residents worked tirelessly to clear the streets and begin the long process of reconstruction. Now, one of the most significant and ambitious projects undertaken was the raising of the entire city. Engineers proposed elevating Galveston to protect it from future storms, a project that was both unprecedented and monumental in scope. Buildings were jacked up, sometimes as much as 17 feet, and sand and dirt were pumped in to fill the space below. Streets were raised, and a new seawall stretching more than 10 miles was constructed to shield the island from future storm surges. This engineering marvel not only transformed the landscape of Galveston, but also demonstrated the city's resilience and commitment to surviving in a perilous environment. The economic impact of the hurricane was profound. Before the storm, Galveston had been a major port and one of the wealthiest cities in Texas, known for its vibrant culture and booming economy. The hurricane, however, shifted that prosperity to nearby Houston, which emerged as the region's new economic powerhouse. Despite this shift, Galveston remained an important city, continuing to thrive in new ways. Tourism became a significant industry as visitors flocked to see the seawall and the city's ongoing recovery efforts. The storm also had a lasting impact on disaster preparedness and response. The 1900 Galveston hurricane is often cited as a pivotal moment in the development of modern meteorology and emergency management. The scale of the disaster highlighted the need for better forecasting, communication, and evacuation planning. Lessons learned from Galveston influenced policies and procedures that would be implemented in future disasters, helping to save countless lives in the years to come. Galveston's recovery was not just about rebuilding structures, it was about healing a community that had been deeply scarred by tragedy. The loss of thousands of lives left a permanent mark on the city's collective memory, and the stories of those who perished became a part of Galveston's history. Memorials were erected and annual commemorations were held to honor the victims and to remind future generations of the city's resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Today, Galveston stands as a testament to the strength and determination of its people. The city has evolved, but it has never forgotten the lessons of the past. The seawall, the raised buildings, and the memorials are enduring symbols of the city's commitment to protecting its future while honoring its history. Galveston's story is one of survival, resilience, and rebirth, a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming disaster, a community can rise again, stronger and more determined than ever. The 1900 Galveston hurricane remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, but it also serves as a story of hope and recovery. Galveston's ability to rebuild and adapt has inspired countless others, proving that even the most devastating tragedies can lead to renewal and growth. The city's legacy continues to live on, not only in the physical structures that were rebuilt, but also in the spirit of its people, who faced one of nature's fiercest storms and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and resilience.